We have been studying over the last 3 weeks, this will make 4, Ancient Truths for a Modern World. And what we have done is to go back and see Bible truths that the world needs to hear. Now, if someone were to say, well, what subjects will we be looking at? I just have to say, there are many Bible subjects. And wouldn't you really have to say, every Bible subject needs to be heard by the modern world. Today we're going to be looking at Jesus is God. Now last week, we began to see something about Jesus. But we're going to look more specifically, not just that Jesus is a man of history. That was primarily last week. But I want us to see the nature of Jesus, that He is divine, He is deity, or you could say Jesus is God. Not everyone believes that. In fact, you have a very large religious group in the world, Muslims. And they believe that Jesus was one of Islam's many prophets, a good and holy man, but not the Son of God. So certainly they believe in Jesus as a man of history. They would even elevate Him beyond being just a man. But they don't believe about Jesus like the Bible teaches about Jesus. Another religious group, kind of common as they will often knock on your door, Jehovah's Witnesses. This quote is from some of their own material. Jehovah's Witnesses do not worship Jesus and do not believe that He is Almighty God. So they are believing differently about Jesus than the Bible teaches. But if we were to say the general population, what do they believe? We looked at this last week as we were examining, is Jesus a man of history? And we see that as concerns what do people believe about Jesus, we find that some believe He's God, some believe He's only a religious or spiritual leader, and some are simply not sure. Well, as you can see this here, if you could kind of read it, you've got over 50%, 56% of all adults are saying Jesus is divine, deity, God. When you get to the younger generation, the millennials, and yes, sometimes they get picked on, but yet we'd see that the number is dropping, that only about 46 to 48% are believing that He is deity or divine or God. But friends, as we are going to look and see what the Bible says about Jesus today, we're going to see that the Bible doesn't just say He's a religious or spiritual leader, but it elevates Jesus far beyond just that. But that He's divine, deity, or God. And so this morning we're going to see a number of reasons to believe in the divinity or deity of Jesus. First of all, the eternal nature of Jesus speaks of Jesus' divinity. His eternal nature, the idea that He always has been and always will be. Then somebody might raise their hand and say, "Preacher, now what I understand about our souls is that they live beyond the grave and for an eternity, either in heaven or in hell." That's true. But each of us, we had a conception, a beginning. We have not always been Jesus. Always has been, always will be. We find in John chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Now, as you would take the phrase, in the beginning, you cannot help but kind of remember the first words, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. In the beginning. This is taking us back to before even the world existed. But there was the Word. And we find the Word was with God. Now we may scratch our heads and say, okay, who is the Word? We'll find in John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word became flesh. Jesus. Jesus. In the beginning was Jesus. And Jesus was God. Look at John 8:58. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Now there's two things I want you to see in this verse. Two things I think of great significance. First, it has to do with that word before. Before Abraham was. Well, we could kind of put this on a timeline, and if we did, we'd find an approximate year for Abraham, 1900 BC. We could kind of choose a number approximate for Jesus. Let's just say 29 AD. Well, you know, as you look at that, you think, wait. Jesus after Abraham. But Jesus said, before Abraham, I was. That's right. Before Abraham, there was Jesus. Oh, by the way, after Abraham, there was Jesus. What is this telling us? This is telling us Jesus' nature is eternal, and therefore He is divine. A second thing I'd like for you to see about this verse is the I am. Now, I recognize we could kind of read through that quickly, not see the significance, but it is significant. In Exodus 3, verse 13 and 14, this has to do with when God was saying, Moses, you're going to lead Israel out of Egypt. And he's like, I'm not so sure about that, God. And then we find some questions he asked God. He says, they asked me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. When Jesus said before Abraham was, I am, there was this connection with Exodus 3, verse 14, where Jesus is identifying Himself as the I am. That's right, when Jesus referred to Himself as the I am, He identified Himself with the great I am, or God. John 8:58 speaks of the eternal nature of Jesus. Now look at John 17, verse 5. And now, O Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. This is towards the beginning of the prayer of Jesus in John chapter 17. And what does He acknowledge? That Jesus was before the world existed. Which once again, that indicates His eternal nature. We see other passages. Hebrews 13 verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Once again, this speaks of His eternal nature. And then as you get to Revelation 1 verse 8, and if you read this within context, you'd think this has to do with Jesus. And it says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. Like I said, read it within context. It's Jesus. And Jesus, the same yesterday, who is and was, today and forever, and who is to come. Jesus is eternal in His nature, and this would suggest to us He is divine, deity, God. Who else has an eternal nature. But secondly, notice the creation speaks of Jesus' divinity. We already made mention of Genesis 1:1 just briefly, where you read, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. At our very first lesson, as we wanted to see one thing the world needs to know today, an ancient truth, and one of the most ancient with the Bible, in the beginning, God. And we talked about the existence of God. But going back to Genesis 1:1, what do you see about God? He's the creator. Now, I recognize that God made man pretty intelligent in the sense that, while in the last 100, 150 years, the advancement of technology is incredible. But I want to tell you something. Man may have rearranged some atoms. Man may have been able to put together some things. But God's the only creator. But yet, what do we see about Jesus in creation? In John 1, verse 3, all things were made through Him. Context, it's Jesus. All things were made through Jesus. Without Him was not anything made that was made. Remember, creation is only a prerogative of God. But yet we see all things were made through Jesus. John 1:10, and the world, He was in the world. The world was made through Him, yet the world did not know Him. We turn our attention to Colossians 1:16 and 17. For by Him, once again, within the context very clearly, this is speaking of Jesus, Jesus Christ. For by Him, by Jesus, all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through Him and for Him. You don't get out of that verse without seeing the creative prerogative and power of Jesus. I remind you again how Genesis 1:1 starts. In the beginning, God created. So this is identifying Jesus with the Father, with God. Verse 17, and He is before all things. This speaks of His eternal nature, doesn't it? And in Him all things hold together. We might wonder why there is any order at all in this universe. He's holding it together. So look at Hebrews 1, beginning in verse 1. Long ago, and at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days He has spoken to us by His Son. Now, oftentimes we go to this verse and we make the contrast of how God spoke in the old times and how He's speaking today. Before, various ways, various times by the prophets. But today, through His Son. And so we have that New Testament will of Christ. But then it says about Jesus, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom, look at this now, through whom also He created the world. Once again, I'd remind you, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But here, calling attention to Jesus, through whom He also created the world. Then it describes Jesus. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. And then He upholds the universe by the word of His power. Once again, it's kind of like what we read in Colossians. It's Jesus holding it together. Jesus providing the order in the world, in the universe that we have. Then he goes on, after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Now, I don't want someone to misunderstand what I'm saying today. You see, there are those who teach that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are all one person. The Bible teaches distinct personalities of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, yet all eternal, divine deity, or God by their nature. We've already seen some passages. For instance, John 17:5. Jesus is praying. He's not praying to himself. He's praying to the Father in heaven. So we see the distinct personalities. But there in verse 5, we'd seen the eternal nature of Jesus. Here we see the creative power of Jesus, which is reserved for God. Genesis 1:1. But now we find, as it speaks of redemption, it says, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Once again, here's the Father, the Majesty on high, and he sits down at his right hand. Okay, that's to my right, maybe to your left. Distinct personality, but each being divine. We also would see that Jesus' birth, in addition to his eternal nature, in addition to his creative power, his birth speaks of Jesus' divinity. We understand about birth, conception has its beginning, but we can kind of scratch our heads with Jesus and say, how is it that an eternal being then is born of woman? How is it that this happened? It just doesn't make sense to me. We find in Isaiah 7:14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Realizing that he's always been, it almost demands that his birth is of a different nature than yours and mine. We find the fulfillment, Matthew 21, verses 22 and 23. And this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. That's Isaiah 7:14. They shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. And so it was that Jesus, his conception was not like yours nor mine. But yet, Mary was a virgin. And yes, this was a virgin birth. Even his birth, that speaks to his divinity. And friends, Jesus' life, it speaks of Jesus' divinity. There has never been one like Jesus. Not before and not since. When we get to Romans, find Romans chapter 1 is essentially saying, Gentiles, you're sinners. You get to Romans chapter 2 and essentially it's saying, Jews, you're sinners. And you get to chapter 3, it's basically saying, the sum of it all is, well, verse 23. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That's man. Sinners. Jesus is that exception, showing he's more than just a man. Look at Hebrews chapter 4:15. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So in every way we've been tempted, Similarly, he's been tempted. We sinned. Jesus did not. 1 Peter 1:22, he committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. Continuing to see about Jesus, 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. You can see passage after passage saying Jesus did not sin. And you get to 1 John 3 verse 3. And everyone who thus hopes in him purifies himself as he is pure. He did not sin. Kind of a negative way of saying, in a positive way, he is pure. And now we could call a witness. And by the way, we might want to say he's a hostile witness. This was not a disciple of Jesus. This is Pilate. This is the one who consented to Jesus' death, gave him over to the Jews. And it says, but Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising. He took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. Pilate calls Jesus just. By the way, if a man in a court of law today, standing as judge, says, I am sentencing this just man to death, there would probably be an uprising from those sitting in those benches in that courtroom. It would be noised abroad. Every newspaper, every media outlet would be blasting the words of that judge, calling the man just, but sentencing him to death. It's what Pilate did. But once again, it's as if, okay, it's not just now the disciples of Jesus writing he is innocent, that he is pure, that he did no sin. Even Pilate recognizes Jesus is just. So Jesus' life speaks of Jesus' divinity. But we also see that within his life, the miracles of Jesus speaks of Jesus' divinity. We find in John 2:11, this, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Here we would see signs or miracles that he was doing was demonstrating his glory. And then the result, the disciples believed in him. Now just a chapter later we're going to see as well that here someone recognized the miracles. There's got to be a connection with God. Nicodemus, John 3. The man came to Jesus by night, said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And so these signs, oh yes, you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, but John in a very specific way records signs so that you might come to believe. It wasn't just that Jesus lived a sinful life. That in and of itself says he's not just a man. But here he's doing these miracles, manifesting his glory. But see also that Jesus speaks of his own divinity. In John 5 verse 17, Jesus answered and said, My Father is working until now, and I am working. This was why the Jews were seeking the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, Now look at this. Making himself equal with God. Now it may be that you and I, we don't quite pick up on this when he says, my Father. They did. And this is their understanding. That by calling God his own Father, he made himself equal with God. In Semitic culture, Son of God does not imply a source of being in inferiority, but signifies instead the sameness of nature and equality of being. There can be no doubt that the Jews of this time understood it in this way. And so it is. Jesus was speaking of his own divinity. But I want you to see too that there are a lot of different ones in the New Testament who speak of Jesus' deity or divinity. There was John. John was the one who said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John wrote those words. We read about Nathanael in John 1:49. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. We can read about Thomas, and Thomas who said, my Lord and my God. By the way, this is the Thomas just a few verses earlier. What did he say? He said to them, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand in his side, I will never believe. You know, sometimes we say, doubting Thomas, doubting Thomas. Do you realize he basically was saying, I want what you got. They had been able to do just this, to see just this. The mark of the nails in his hands. That place in his side that the soldier had pierced. The other disciples, they'd had that opportunity. Thomas wasn't present. And he says, I want to see the same thing. When he saw it, he says, my Lord and my God. Believing Thomas, he speaks to Jesus' divinity. Then there was a centurion, by the way, kind of like Pilate, we might say, okay, here's a witness, but we want to consider him a hostile witness. After all, being a centurion, yes, he'd have been one of those Roman soldiers who had part in crucifying Jesus. And what do you read here? When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, by the way, all these are the events of the cross itself. They see all of this, and he says, truly this was the Son of God. He's made to believe. You see, all of these speaking of Jesus' divinity. The Apostle Paul writes kind of clearly, for in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. That means God in flesh. And he says in Philippians 2, verses 5 and 6, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. And so here, Paul again speaks of Jesus being God. But, you know, I'd have to say this. Of all the things we've seen about proving the deity, divinity, the nature of Jesus as God, this is what impresses me the most of all. It's kind of like if you could bring the most trusted witness to testify. Friends, it's God the Father himself. At Jesus' baptism, there was that voice from heaven, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Similarly, at Jesus' transfiguration, you hear words like this. But the passage that most impresses me is found in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. But of the Son he says. In other words, these would be words of God the Father about the Son. And what does the Father say? Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. The Father acknowledges the divine nature of Jesus. If all of this lesson didn't exist but this one verse, if no other passage that we've acknowledged, looked at, studied was in the New Testament, if this was there, that's enough. Jesus, His nature, is divine. He is deity. He's God. Now very quickly, as we looked at this briefly last week, Jesus' resurrection speaks of Jesus' divinity. He was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by His resurrection from the dead. Yes, this is an ancient truth that the world today needs to hear, that Jesus is God. And I would remind you, as we did last week, the crucifixion was a common means of execution in the New Testament world. The Romans used this as a form of execution for criminals. Even when Jesus was crucified, there were two others that day, Jesus being the cross in the midst or the middle. The cross, they were made. They were forced upon the cross. Jesus, they may have thought that they put Jesus there, but probably one of the only ones that went to the cross willingly. And He went willingly, but not as a man, but as the one sent from heaven, come from heaven. The one that was from the beginning, the one that was of eternal nature. The one that Himself existed with the Father in glory before the world was. I do not believe you see the love of God, the love of Jesus. Oh, you see it in various ways, but never, I think, to the extent when you see the cross. Jesus, God, on the cross. If we could assist you in your obedience this morning, if there is yet the need for baptism, if you're that believer who has turned from his sins, we could assist you in giving you the opportunity to confess Jesus as the Son of God, to then assist you in baptism for the remission of sins. And if there's need for prayer, we can take this time and pray for you. If you need to come, please come.